Almost 3 years ago, I have met with my boss. And my boss told me something that I was waiting for, I was hoping for. He told me that I was supposed to be a dedicated QA lead within a new project. That was supposed to be the first project where I was supposed to be a QA lead. And I was really happy. But what does it mean? It means that I was supposed to be the one who will be talking to the client, planning testing activities, coordinating testing activities, etc. And this presentation is a case study of this project. So I will tell you basically my story of the first project where I became the QA lead. So let's go back to the story. Myself and the team of leaders, we were shipped over to the United Kingdom, to the client's office, where we have met with the client, and we had multiple meetings, multiple presentations. Basically, we all sat down together, and we tried to understand what the client wants. What are we supposed to deliver? Some red flags that we encountered is that the deadline was a little bit unrealistic, so they wanted us to deliver a little bit too fast. We were supposed to integrate with a missing API, and the client had no clear requirements. So they had designs, they knew what they want on high level, but when we deep dived into the discussions, then it became a little bit fuzzy. And here comes something that we not very often discuss, but there was a related presentation yesterday, a topic of time to market. So basically, how fast can you deliver your software? How fast can you deliver a new application to be available to your customers, to the end users? And basically, it's not necessarily the only thing that matters. So obviously, we want to deliver things fast, but also we want to maintain a high quality. But it's not always the case that we can deliver the projects of the highest quality possible. Sometimes clients want deliberately to have lower quality, but software delivered a little bit faster. So I would like to tell you a small example. That's Friendster. Who has ever heard of Friendster? Nobody. I really recommend listening to this podcast, which describes, it's linked down there in the corner, and it describes the story of Friendster. Basically, it's one of the first social networks out there. It launched in 2002, so 4 years before Facebook. And it was an overwhelming success. In first month, they had 4 million users. It was the first thing on the market, or at least one of the first things. So the CEO of the company, he was on the news, on the newspaper, so everyone knew, at least in the United States, about Friendster. Everyone joined in. But what happened is that they were overwhelmed with the usage. So they faced some serious performance problems, the site was slow, and eventually the users shifted to MySpace, then Facebook, and right now nobody remembers Friendster. And this is a nice example. We had something similar here in Poland, so we had Nasza klasa, our class in English, and the story was a little bit the same because they were one of the first social networks in here, and they also faced some serious performance problems. So if you remember those times, Nasza klasa was really slow. Eventually, they figured out their way out of those slowness, but it was a little bit too late, and eventually, Facebook appeared also in Poland. So what does that story learn us? What can we learn from this story? We can learn that time to market is important. So you can succeed by being the first one on the market, but you need to remember about the quality. So you need to find a balance between quality and time to market. Of course, you can launch, but then you need to fix all the most relevant issues as soon as possible. Otherwise, other will launch a perfect software, or at least better software, and they will prevail. So let's go back to my story. What were we supposed to deliver? Basically, it was a web application that was supposed to replace the current website that the client currently used. They had some very specific business needs. So they did marketing studies, marketing surveys that indicated that when the clients entered the website, then afterwards they thought less of the brand. So they were less eager to buy the products, and thus the need to replace the website as fast as possible. What I was used to is a small Scrum team, so maybe 10, 15 people at most, or Scrumish team. And here I found out that we were supposed to have many, many more people involved because we needed to deliver a little bit more fast. And for some of you, it might be obvious that such projects appear, but if you come from a background of this one team, self-organizing team, and you are supposed to deliver within a team of 50, 60, or even more people, then at times it can become a little bit overwhelming. So we did what we knew. We divided ourselves into smaller teams. Obviously, you cannot have one team which works in a Scrumish way of 60 people. So we divided ourselves into 6 teams. To add a little bit of fun factor, we named ourselves after colors from Star Wars. So rather than having names like Team A, B, C, or Team 1, 2, 3, we named ourselves Team Black, Team Green, Team Silver, etc. And everyone knew that it comes from Star Wars. To add a little bit more fun, we also renamed our releases. So instead of having a release name like 0.2, we named our releases after planets from Star Wars. And it turns out there are lots and lots of those. We had, for example, a release named Tatooine, but it didn't explode like Tatooine did. So let's go back to our teams. Each of the team had various team members. So each of the teams had a project manager, there was a dedicated business analyst, we had quality assurance engineers and developers, both front-end and back-end developers. And they all worked within one stream, one self-organizing team, and they worked together to deliver software within smaller teams to achieve a higher goal of delivering the whole project. So we sat down, we divided ourselves. Of course, we started with one team, and gradually we added more and more teams to speed up. And here we have fallen into the first trap. I will describe briefly 9 traps that we have fallen into and how we have managed to find our way out of those traps. So the first trap was, where is a clear plan? How do we work within 6 teams that are supposed to be self-organizing, but the whole team is supposed to be self-organizing as well? And we knew there will be some communication issues, and we needed to plan those. And we haven't taken really any of those frameworks. So those are some of the ideas how we can scale Scrum. Some frameworks you can read about in literature. We have taken some elements from some of those frameworks, and basically we made our process, the process that suited our needs, and that was a little bit of all, maybe, or a little bit of some. And we haven't came up with this process at once. So it wasn't like we all sat down together in 10-hour meeting and we invented the new process. We gradually found our ways into having something similar like those frameworks. Okay. But we had our processes more or less figured out, but then we had a tools issue. So from technology side, I think that technology is mature enough to deliver software within multiple streams. So you can have multiple people working on the same code base once you coordinate them properly with a proper process, of course. So we used Git, we had multiple environments. So here you have this stream dev and stream staging. So each of the streams had their own 2 environments. And then we integrated on the integration environment, and we also had a UAT environment where the client was signing off all the functionalities that we delivered. This is our workflow in Git. So we can see that we worked on feature branches, and we had two things that we called release. So you might ask where the testing happened, so where we started testing. We started testing already on feature branch, so there's some code review. A QA can also take a look at new feature. But most of the testing happened on the develop branch, so that was the dev environment where we actually went and tested the features by hand. And once all the features within develop were stable enough, we released to master, and later on, we also merged it to the integration develop, which was the branch related to integration server. And once this merge was also confirmed, we released to master and UAT environment. And it worked pretty well. But there is a trap that we haven't anticipated, or we knew that it will happen, but we haven't anticipated the scope of the problem. So if you are familiar with Git or any version control system, then you know that there's such a thing called conflicts. We knew that conflicts will appear, but we haven't anticipated the scale. So during the integration of multiple streams, we tried to merge. At times it was easy, but at times it was harder because during merge, you need to decide which lines to keep, which lines to take. And if it's a more complex conflict, then it's not really obvious how to solve those problems. And you need to find an answer to the question, well, how it's supposed to be working after I merge all of that. So the root cause, maybe one of those, was of the problem was that the person who was doing the actual merge in Git was not always the person that was developing the features beforehand. So he didn't always knew how exactly to solve the conflict. And that's why we started using something that we named very fancy. It was conflict detector. It wasn't any tool. It was simply yet another spreadsheet. And it looked basically like this. So whenever a developer started working on a new feature, he added a new column describing the user story he was working on and functionalities that this particular user story touched. And if we encountered some conflicts, so for example, in the last row, you can see that text functionality, whatever it is, it was touched by at least 2 user stories, because there can be many, many more. And what happened then? If we saw that something becomes red, then we had our technical leader, so a technical person, taking a look at those stories, taking a look what exactly happened and whether it will cause problems. As you can see, in some cases, it was a simple thing, but in some of those, it was a possible dependency or a more complex problem. And in these cases, we deep dived into user stories and we anticipated the problem. So it's not a perfect solution, it's a solution. But what it did, it allowed us to anticipate the problems, predict those before they happened. And thus, we resolved the conflicts more easy way. So you might ask, we are working in multiple streams, we have multiple teams working together, so I guess you have some automation, right, to speed things up. And of course, we had some unit tests, but we started with no automation. Reason being, we worked with a corporate client, and for some of you who come from a corporate background, it might seem obvious, but for me it wasn't at the time. Some corporations have lists of approved software that you can use. And in this corporation, we hadn't had any automation related software that we were allowed to use. So they asked us, let's start without automation because you are not allowed to use automation. Very weird problem. And we did so. We had also no servers, so no Jenkins at the beginning, for example. And we developed automation debt. So lack of automation that we needed to address later on. So what we did, we kept the list of all the features, or at least of all the core features that we want to automate later on. And we were like, once we got software approved, we were like this guy, let's automate all the things. But then you all might know the problem. Once you were like the first guy, then you become like the second guy. So there are too many things to automate. So how do you deal with such a problem? To be honest, I don't have a solution. We have dealt with it in such a way that we have automated only the core or most important functionalities for us from technical perspective, so the most risky ones, so the ones that were marked by technical leaders as the most risky from technology side. And on the other hand, we had automation that was for features most important for business, so with the highest priority in Jira, for example. This is what we ended up. So some pipeline in Jenkins executing multiple tests in parallel. But to be honest, I cheated here a little bit. So our tests are not always green like they are on the previous slide. So when I was doing the screenshot, I needed to change the icons a little bit. So that's me doing it. It's not like all of the tests were green. It's like every 2-3 runs, 1 or 2 jobs were red. So there were either issues to be resolved or instabilities within the test. So that's one of the problems that we haven't managed to deal with technologically. So we had instabilities within our tests. But what we did to work around this trap that we have fallen into is we have started preparing release notes for the automation. So what did it contain? It contained a link between the version of the application and the status of tests. So we described not only what tests are failing, but also why. If you are familiar with automation, then you know that investigation of why the test is failing is pretty time consuming. And in our circumstances, if we had 6 teams working together and we integrate, and then everyone faces the same instabilities, and if everyone has to find the reason why this particular test is failing, then it's time consuming. That's why we were writing it explicitly. At first, we began with disabling the unstable tests, but we found out that it's not necessarily the best idea, because in our environment, so it might not refer to everyone, in our environment, disabled tests were forgotten. So they were either later on missed, so nobody executed them, or they were resolved later on. So the issues found by the tests were not fixed as soon as possible. So we thought, let's keep the instabilities in there. Let's have all the teams see the issues, what the issues are. Let's have them see also what's the root cause of the issue. So by seeing what's the root cause of the issue, you also see which team is supposed to fix this issue because it's already assigned to someone. And we thought people will basically want to fix those issues because they don't want to be pinpointed by other teams. And we had some release notes, but there's another trap, documentation. So when we started, we asked ourselves, or we might ask ourselves, 3 questions. So who needs documentation? In our case, I thought that documentation is needed mostly by our client, who later on needs to configure the website because it's based on a complex CMS. And we wanted to write a complex documentation that will help them later on properly configure our system. So that's the why. So to be able to properly configure the system. And what makes a good documentation, we thought, will be a documentation that will allow them to work efficiently and would allow even a novice user to configure this application. What we haven't anticipated, maybe it was a little bit foolish from us, is that we are also the beneficiaries from documentation. So it's the most important testing oracle. I was used to small Scrum teams, and if you have a small team, then of course you know who is developing which feature, so it's very easy to go to someone and ask, hey, how is it supposed to be working, or within which ticket you were developing this particular feature. In this case, if you had 60 people, then obviously you cannot know everyone, and you cannot find people so easily. What we did, the first slide says documentation and trust. What we did is also we had an external stakeholders who were supposed to write this documentation later on for us, because it was supposed to be a very complex documentation for users with screenshots, and it was very time consuming to produce. But what happened is these stakeholders were not doing what they were supposed to do, so we ended up with very little documentation, which was very brief, and it was a hard trap to manage around. But eventually, we started simply writing documentation. So we have found a balance of keeping not too complex documentation, because for us, documentation that was good was supposed to be a documentation where we could easily search the tickets or functionalities that we were working on or a particular team was working on earlier. Trap number 6, release. So at first we started with releasing from develop to master and merging from master to integration develop after the end of the iteration. So every team released a stable code base at the end of each iteration, which lasted 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks we integrated. But we then thought it's not such a good idea. I have described the problem with conflicts. So if you stack your changes and then wait till the end of the iteration, then of course you have more changes to address and more conflicts to resolve. And that's why we decided to release as often as possible. But it was not an automated process, so it was also a manual and time-consuming process. And the teams thought that sometimes they were doing only releases. So every 2 days, someone needed to do a release, or every week. So it's like constant release feeling. And that's why we have dedicated one team to be the release pipeline managers, and they have coordinated and executed some of the releases. Of course, it was a smaller team than the other ones, but it turns out it worked pretty nicely, because we shifted the effort to the other team, which, on the other hand, demanded from the other teams to deliver stable and automation and stable code base. So they were the ones verifying if the features from particular streams were stable enough to be merged. Of course, later on, when we came to the end of the project, the number of teams decreased. We had 2, but we have kept the release managers team, but at the end it was only 1 person, but still, he named himself as a silver team. Communication. So what we found out within this project is that the hardest problems to solve was not the technical ones. The hardest ones was communication, so the soft problems. And we have had the other types of conflicts, so not the technical one, but the conflicts between people. So if you have such big teams, so many people, then obviously they all cannot know each other and cannot speak to each other. I mean, they can, but they cannot speak to everyone else. So we have coordinated it a little bit. So we know that project managers have met on Scrum of Scrums meetings where after the Scrum for a particular team, they have described on a high level what a particular team has faced, what kind of issues they are facing, what are the current problems, plans, etc. And the communication on the whole program level looked more or less like this. So each of the teams had their own sprint plannings. We had our own daily scrums. As you can see, there's the Scrum of Scrums on the overall level, so that's the project managers communicating. But developers and QAs were mostly communicating not to the external teams, but within teams. So at first, the people who communicated the most were only leads or project managers. What we had as well is retrospectives. We had retrospectives on, once again, team level. And we had sprint review meeting or sprint demo meeting, which happened only on overall level. So you might think, well, you are missing a few things here, and I think so as well. So I think that we are missing those 3 dots at least. So what we haven't done, but still, we managed our ways around it, is we haven't had this retrospective meeting on the overall level. So the people met within teams. They have discussed issues. They found some ways to solve those. But those were mostly issues within a particular team. Project managers and other leads, of course, have met. So I have met with multiple other leads. And we have discussed some current issues. We have discussed possible solutions that we can find out. And we have addressed the problem. So it's not like we haven't met at all. But still, it was only on demand. So whenever a problem appeared, then we only met. We haven't had some such a dedicated time where we could review how are we going in the right direction, and maybe steer a little bit to other direction. What we haven't had also is sprint review on team level. So we had this one big sprint review on the overall levels, but this was obviously a big meeting where the client was involved and there was not enough space for everyone. And people were reluctant to join it because they were simply afraid of the client, because nobody saw him or them, because there were multiple people, multiple stakeholders. So people knew what they are delivering. So they knew what they are delivering within their team. But they haven't really felt like they belong to the overall program. They only focused on the features that they delivered. And I think that's one of the biggest traps that we have fallen into. So we haven't kept this idea of ourselves as a big team and ourselves celebrating what the other teams delivered as well. So it might have happened that Team Green has delivered something and Team Red hasn't really known what they have delivered until, of course, something breaks and then you see, oh, something broke. What happened? Oh, the green team did it. So that's what happened. People started pinpointing at the other teams. It's not our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the green team to fix it. And I think that was one of the mistakes. And that's why we have tried, at least in the QA team, to break the schema a little bit, and we did something like QA weekly catch-ups. When we have met, it was few people, so QAs from all the teams, and we have basically spoken to each other we have met for half an hour or an hour, and we have discussed what fun defects we have encountered during past week. For example, someone might encounter not an obvious problem and describe it to everyone, and maybe we had a laugh, or maybe we had a little bit harder time understanding what actually happened there. It was also a nice learning exercise, both of the challenges and technical problems that we face within the whole project, but also it was a way of learning what the other teams are delivering. So we could see, we had a substitute for this sprint review meetings when we saw the key functionalities that were delivered by other teams. What it did as well is it also allowed for more efficient rotation between teams, because if someone, for example, went on a sick leave and he was unable to go to job, then we were able to assign a different QA to this particular team, and it happened more easily. And developers, of course, they communicated as well, but they communicated mostly using this tool. So they haven't spoken, they have only crossed the features they were working on. But on the other hand, they had also some group chats, etc., where they could discuss some issues. But still, I think they focused mostly on the communication within team, and they have missed, or we have missed, the idea of communicating as a whole team. And if you will face such issues maybe in the future, or you are facing, I think that it's better to over-communicate rather than under-communicate. We shifted a little bit to the spectrum of under-communicating. So I have mentioned also that we worked in self-organizing teams. So teams, if they are self-organizing, then they can show their creativity. They can show new ideas, implement new ways of working. And this caused also a little bit of problems for us, because we had some common standards, but people had some ideas how to change things, how to work more efficiently. And what they did is they basically improved the way they were working, and eventually they were delivering better and better software. But it happened only in few teams. Others were not so creative, had different processes. And what we ended up is various teams delivering software of different quality. And then the problem started because once again, people started pinpointing at each other, and they started blaming other teams. We haven't had this feeling of a joint team, which I referred to earlier. And I'm not necessarily stating that creativity is against standards. What I'm only saying here is that we made this mistake, or we have fallen into this trap of not taking this creativity and not embracing it in common standards. It was only embraced by specific teams. And thus, we have fallen into the trap. I have described the other one's conflicts, so the conflicts between people. This project, it was a hard project for our company, and what we ended up after almost 2 years is some of the people, they liked each other at the beginning because they knew each other from previous project, but at the end, some of the people decided not to talk to each other ever again. So that was unexpected. Of course, after a few months, things worked out and they started communicating, but it was very, very tough. So the lesson here is that not the technical problems were the problems that we faced, the communication problems were the hardest ones. So we have managed our way through the technical ones. It might not be the perfect way, I agree, but it was a way. We have managed to deliver the software. And what was next? What was next is we have launched our rocket. So we have launched our website, it's working, the client is satisfied. It's not a website, not an application of perfect quality, but it's good enough for the client. It's a huge improvement compared to what was earlier there. But I would like to state here that at the beginning I mentioned that we have this time to market, but once you deliver, you need to improve what you have delivered. So right now we are in the phase of improving. So of course we are still delivering new features in smaller teams, but this project is right now focused also on fixing the defects. There are no critical defects like the website crashes completely or any area crashes completely, but there are the small things that tell you, well, I don't want to use this website and I don't want to buy products from this company. And why am I presenting this? Why am I standing here and discussing those problems? This was my personal story. At first I was a little bit afraid of the project. I thought it's a little bit too big, and why are we supposed to deliver it too fast? And we haven't met the deadline that the client described for us, so we had delivered it a little bit later. But I would like to state here that you maybe shouldn't be afraid. If you will stand in my shoes sometimes and face a similar issue, then don't be afraid of such projects. Of course, you will face some traps, you will face some challenges and some problems, but I think that in our industry is filled with intelligent people, and once you sit down and discuss the problems, then you can find a way around them. You can find a solution. And here I have described at least some of the problems that you can anticipate. And I think that there's no perfect solution. I think that everyone will find their own solution and their own ways around those traps, or you will even face different traps. And that's why I would like to end this presentation and invite you to discussion. Maybe you have similar things that you have encountered, or any questions to how we manage through different problems. Go on. Yeah.
So what exactly did you do? I mean, maybe that's too general question. Were you involved in one of those small teams, or were you like on the side, were you advanced?
Okay, so I was involved in 2 teams. So I was involved in the silver team, which coordinated the releases, but I was also involved in one of the teams, maybe not testing particular features too often, but still I tried to test to see what we are working on, not to go too far away from the reality of other testers. But so it was a complex situation because I was in those 2 teams. And on the other hand, I was also part of this leadership team which met with the client and we discussed the issues. So for example, this Git, this tool problem that we weren't allowed to use automation. And we were the ones who met with the client on a regular basis, and we said, well, it's not working, we need to change it. And eventually, through honest communication, we got our software, our tools approved.
Okay, and in this team you were involved in where the testing happened. Were you the only tester or one of the testers?
One off.
One of?
One off, yes.
Okay, and wasn't, I mean, I don't know the structure in your company, but wasn't that a problem in a Scrum team that you as a lead were also involved and you should be same level?
Okay, so at this company, we usually work in such a way that if we have a project, we always have cross-functional, so we have QAs, developers, etc. But if we have a project that has 2 or 3 QAs, then in each of those projects, we dedicate a person who's named a QA lead, and that's a person who both tests features, but also that's the person who, for example, writes the QA plan and QA strategy for the project, and later on, for example, reports to the client what is the progress, what is the current status of the application, etc. And that's the way we were used to. So that's the way we worked here as well. And I think within this small team, it doesn't face any issue. What it does, it also allows other testers to more easily step into your shoes and become QA leads in the future.
Okay, that's against Scrum, but I'm totally okay with it.
Okay, that's Scrumish.
Thank you.
Jakub accepted. Another question? Last chance? Okay, it's good.
There was a graphic that showed the structure of the meetings you had in both of the, yes, exactly this one. And I would like to ask about the backlog refinement. Did you maintain the backlog at the single team level, and how?
Okay, so backlog refinement was done mostly by BAs. So as you can see, BAs were involved within each particular team, and they were the ones, I haven't mentioned here this, but the BAs have met together and they have basically done the backlog refinement. But it was a high-level one where they decided which features will go to which particular team and more or less when we plan to deliver those. And later on, those landed into a particular team, which later on groomed the user story with the BA. I hope it answers at least partially.
Okay, so why did you write the documentation if you had a business analyst in the team?
Interesting question. So, where do we have it? Cool. So what we do is we have written user stories. We tried to keep it maybe BDD-alike, so that mostly describe actions that we expect from a given functionality. And later on, we wanted the description of those features to be available to the end users, so people who will use the application. And we cannot do it because, or in any backtracking software or any tool like that. So we tend to give them some kind of manuals, usually written in Confluence, and that's what we did, and that's the way we shifted into. And in the company where it happened, we used to write documentation mostly by developers, so the developers are the ones who are writing the documentation later on. So, and the BAs are only writing specific documentation, which later on, in some cases, can be simply copied into the other places, but enriched with more content like screenshots, how to configure a specific thing. They were only making user stories and epics within a tool. We were not using Jira, a different tool, but still that's the only level they worked with. Thank you very much.